Hello guys and welcome to episode 3. In the previous session what we did is we have created an environment file and then we have created a configuration file in which we read the variables from our environment file, and we have used this configuration file in our server so far, in our server file. We have also created 3 different folders, if you recall: services, routes, and controllers, and this pattern is used a lot. I have, by the way, emptied those files and then we're gonna start from the beginning, but this time we're gonna be using MongoDB as a database, and we're gonna be creating a library database, and we will see how we can use this pattern to properly create CRUD APIs. And at the end we're also gonna see how to use a very popular package called JOI, which is gonna be used to validate our incoming data from the request, from the body. If you don't have MongoDB already installed on your machine, you can go to their official website, which I'm gonna keep in the description, and then you can scroll down and choose which installation to get depending on your operating system. And there are 2 editions, Community Edition and Enterprise Edition. I have the Community Edition installed on my machine. Also, you can enable a very important tool, or a useful tool, called MongoDB Compass. You can also download it separately, by the way, and you don't really need it to use MongoDB, but I like to use it because you could see the database in front of you. So after installing it, you can go to new connection here, and then let's connect locally. Now locally I have many databases here. Basically this is not a MongoDB course, so I'm not going to go into the details, but what you need to know is that each database consists of multiple collections. So you could think of a collection to be as a table. So if you know SQL, a collection is like a table, and then each collection has many documents, and each document is a record in the database. Also, one good thing about MongoDB is its flexibility. So each document doesn't have to have the same schema as the second one. Like, each document can have different properties, different keys. Let's go back to our Visual Studio Code here. And the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna install a very popular package called Mongoose. Basically, Mongoose is an ORM, an object relational mapper. So here what we're gonna do is, by the way, we don't need Mongoose if you wanna talk to MongoDB, but it's very popular and powerful, so we're gonna be using it. Basically, we create a schema for our collection, and then based on that schema we create a model, and using that model we can create instances and communicate with our database using objects. Let's go ahead and install it. npm I mongoose. Now after installing it, let's go ahead and create a variable called mongoose and require it from mongoose. Also, I'm gonna zoom in so it's more readable for you. Now what we need to do is connect to our database, and for that we're going to be using our mongoose variable. So let's say mongoose dot, we're going to use a method called connect, and this method, if we take a look here, it takes a string which is going to be the connection string for our database. So like the last time in the previous episode, we're going to create another variable in our .env, and I'm going to call it connection string. Now to get that, we can go to our DB compass, and here if we look under our host, we can see that those DBs are locally on our machine. So the domain is going to be localhost, and the port is this one here, this number here. I'm going to take that, and then here let's say MongoDB / put this, and then slash, and here we need to type the name of our database. We haven't created our database yet, but we're going to call it library, so let's save that. And now let's go to our config file. Like last time, we need to add this property. I'm going to call it connection string, and the value will be process.env. It will read from the connection string, which is this one here in our .env file. Now here, since we have already imported this config file, we already also added this new key here, connection string. So what we can do is say config dot, and connection string. Now this is gonna return a promise, as you can see here. So we can use .then, and here let's give it a function. So when this connection happens, if it's successful, I'm gonna add this code in here. So if we are successfully connected, or when we successfully connect to our database, then I'm gonna make my app listen to the port coming from the config, which is gonna be 3000. We set this to 3000. And then also we can add a different message as well. We can also say console.log connected to DB. And then let's add a catch block in case we catch an error and the connection isn't successful. And then I'm gonna give it a function, and let's just say console.log error connecting to DB. Now that we are connected to our database, we can start making operations, like we can add data to it, we can retrieve data, update, and so on. Let's go to our routes and let's think together. So we have a database which isn't shown here yet, which is called library. In a library, what do we have? We have books, we have authors for a book, we have many collections that we can come up with. I'm gonna start with book, so let's say book.js. And now, if you watched the last video, this is gonna be like a training for you now. If you remember, we need to import Express first of all. Let's require Express. And this is to use the router function in Express. So now we can say const router equal express.router. And now what we can do is we can use this router to specify our APIs. So let's say get first of all, or let's start with post, let's say. If you remember, our APIs or requests have different methods. The most important ones are get, post, delete, put, and delete. Post is used to add data, so we're going to be adding data to our database using this. And here let's specify the route. Let's say book, for example, or /book/create. And then here what we did last time, if you recall, is we called a function or a method in our controllers. So for now I'm going to keep it empty. I'm going to save that. And now let's save and go to our controllers. In our controllers as well, we need a book file, book.js file. And if you recall, we created a class last time, but you could use functions without a class. I'm going to create a class, and I want to import that class directly, so I'm going to say module.exports equal, and then the class, I'm going to call it book controller. In this book controller, we're going to have the CRUD operations. Let's start with the first function. And since we're in a class, we don't use the keyword function, we directly type the function name. So I'm going to say create book, for example. And this function, if you recall, takes 3 parameters: request, response, and next. And here what we said last time is we're going to be calling a service, so call a service, and then we're going to return a response, so we're responding to the request. Now before continuing, I'm going to go to our services folder, and create a new file as well, book.js again. And here we're going to be having a class as well, and I'm going to export it to be able to use it outside. So module.exports equal, and let's call it class book service. And here as well, usually what we do is we use the same method name. So here, for example, I have a create book method in the controller. I'm going to also have a create book method in our service. So let's go to our service and create that. And here it's going to take a book that we're going to be adding to our DB. For now, that's what we're going to type. Let's go ahead and test this API. So here, let's call our controller, and to be able to call it, first of all, of course, we already exported this, so we can use it here. I'm going to create a variable and call it book controller equal require, and then let's go back twice, so 2 dots, Let's go to our controllers and then book. And now we need to create an instance of that class. And to do that, let's create another one called book controller, for example, or book instance controller, or whatever you want, and equal new book controller. Now with this newly created instance, we're going to be accessing the methods here. We have create book, so let's use it here, and let's say book controller dot create book. Don't forget, we do not need those two parentheses. And here, to be able to use this router outside, we're gonna have to say module dot exports and then equal router. We also need to add this middleware in our server.js to be able to use it. So this is a repetition of what we did last time, but I'm going through faster, and we're going to be building using CRUD operations for our database. So here I'm going to say const book router equal require. Let's give it the path dot slash routes slash book. And now let's add this middleware, so app dot use route book router. Let's test this API. Let me save this. I'm not gonna return data from the service right now because we already know how to do that, but we're gonna be doing it, of course, in this video using MongoDB. We're getting data from MongoDB, but just to test that this API is working, I'm gonna just say, let's say let book equal request.body, and I'm gonna explain what this is, and then let's say response.send book. Now let's run our application, so nodemon server, and make sure everything is saved. As you can see, connected to DB, and this is because the connection has been successfully made, and then app listening on port 3000. Let's go to Postman, and first let's go to routes. As you can see, book slash create is the route. We're running on localhost port 3000. So now if we type this route, and here we have the post method because we are adding, we're going to be adding or sending data to our database, and here of course we specify that it's a post API here, so here the request should be post. And now, as you can see here, there's a section called body, and if you recall, in our controller here we created a variable which we set the value to be request.body. So the request, we've already said that previously in the previous episodes, is the request object, the actual request. .body is this section right here, and if you recall, what we said in server.js is app.use express.json. So we're going to be receiving JSON from our body. So here by default it's none, we're going to go to raw, and then here if it's not JSON by default it's text, you need to go and pick JSON. So here let's create a JSON object with one value or two values. Let's say name, for example, double name, and let's say author, for example, author name. Now if we send that, as you can see, the response was the actual request.body object, and that's because here in our controller we are sending this book which has a value of request.body. So it's taking the request.body and then sending it again. Of course that's not what we want, but now we know that our API is working, so we can go ahead and progress in our application. If you recall, I previously said that with Mongoose we're going to be creating a schema and then a model from that schema that we can create instances of to represent our objects that we're going to be adding, or our documents that we're going to be adding to our database. So for that, let's create another folder and let's call it models. Okay, I already have created this folder. I forgot to tell you that previously. If you don't have it, you're going to have to create it. And then inside this models folder, I'm going to create a file called book.js. Now here, since we're going to be using Mongoose, of course, we're going to need to create a variable and then require it. So require Mongoose. And now let's say our schema is called book schema equal new. We're going to create a new schema, and for that we need to say mongoose.schema. Let's open the parentheses and then the curly braces. Now here we're going to specify the properties that we have. So let's say for our book we have a name or a title. So let's say name, and here the type is string. Also notice sometimes you might see it online, or you can use it yourself with curly braces and then say type, and here specify string. And you can use this if you have different properties, such as default, for example, to set a default value, required to require it, and more. But to keep it simple, and since I'm only using type now, I'm going to say string. And then author, for now I'm going to keep a string, but in the future videos we're going to use an ID, because we're going to have a different collection for the author. Let's say we have number of pages. It's going to be a number. Let's also say we have a summary, which is a string. Of course, in a real application we have date, we have many other properties, but to keep it simple, I'm just gonna save that. Also notice we didn't add an ID, which is a primary key. That's because MongoDB is gonna add one for us by default, so we don't need to specify it here. Now with this schema, we're gonna create a model. So we can say, for example, book model equal, and let's say mongoose.model. This is a function or method to create a model. Here, as you can see, it takes a name and a schema. The name, let's just call it book. And here, the convention is that we type it this way. So B is capital, and it's in the singular form. And what Mongoose does is it reads this name and then translates it into a smaller b, and then adds an s at the end. And this is going to be the collection name created in our database. So I'm going to keep it book, and then here we need to add the schema, which is going to be book schema. Now we can use this model to create instances or documents that we're going to be adding to our database. Now we need to import it, to export it to the outside to be able to use it. So I'm just going to say module.exports equal this, and let's save. Now I'm going to go to the service again. And here we're going to be using our model. So I'm going to say constant book model equal require // models / book. And now here, when we receive a book, what we're going to be doing is we're going to create a new instance of that book model here, which, if you remember, we have created our structure, our schema here. And I know I already said that MongoDB can have different type of documents. They don't need to have the same structure, but usually what we do is we use the same structure, the same schema, and that's what we're doing here. And here now let's create an instance. So I'm going to say book or book model or book to save or book to add or whatever equal new book model. And then here what we can do is we can take this book right here and then pass it here. Or what we could have done is we could have opened the curly braces, and then we could have said, for example, name book.name, and so on, author author.name. But since we already have the object, we're gonna just pass it. And I don't know if you noticed yet, but this could have any value, like this could have any properties. This could have properties that do not exist in our schema, which is wrong. So what we are gonna add at the end of this video, or maybe soon, is a package called JOI, in which we're gonna validate the data incoming before even entering our controller here. So it's gonna be a middleware. But for now, okay, we have created this instance. We have, which is an instance of book model. We have passed the book that we need to take the properties from. And then what we can do is say book to add .save. And this is a function to save to MongoDB. Now, this method is asynchronous. So what we need to do, because we're saving to the database and it saves it in an async way, so we should here add the keyword async, and then here we can say return book to add.save, and we're going to say return await book to add.save. So whenever we have async, we have await, and this is because here the book to add.save is an asynchronous method. If you don't know the difference between sync and async, so usually when we don't have async, each line of code is executed after the other. However, if we have async await, the async await block does not block the execution of the code, so it skips it and then continues until the result comes back using await. Don't worry much about async await. I know it's not very easy to understand from the first time. If you don't know it already, it's okay, but just know that we're going to be using async await for our APIs and for our database operations. And let's go to our controller, and here as well it's going to be async. And this time what we're going to be doing is we need to call our service and then pass the book to our service. That way we're going to create a new model and save it. So to do that, we need to import it in the controller. So let's say const book service equal require dot slash services slash book, and then let's create an instance of that class. So book service equal new book service, and now with this instance we can have access to the methods. So here we need to call the service after this line. So I'm gonna say, we can say result, for example, const result equal await, and we're using await because the function that we're calling is asynchronous. So book service dot, and now we have access to the create book method, and if you take a look, it takes a book, so we're going to pass it the book here, and let's put a semicolon, and then now what we can do is if result, then we can send this res.book, and what we can do is say else. So if we don't have a result, we can say res.send error. For now we're going to keep it that way, but in the future, in future videos, we're going to use a try catch block with error handling, create a global error handler, add it to the middleware, and a lot more. But it's okay, let's keep it this way for now. This is not the best, but let's keep it that way just to make it work for now. Actually here I want to return the result that we get, and this result, if we remember, this is what we get from the service. What we are returning here from the Mongoose operation method.save, which will return the newly saved document from MongoDB, just to know what we have added or what record it has added. Now if we take a look at our model again, we have name, author, number of pages, and summary. This is our schema. So in Postman here we need to add number of pages, which is a number, so we need to pass in a number, and we also have summary, so let's add that as well, and let's just say summary of the book. Let's send a request, and let's make sure that we are running the server, so not my server, and then Postman. If we press on send, if we take a look here, we got the result as a response, and there's two newly added fields, which are ID and version. The ID, if you recall, I already said previously that if we don't add the ID, we usually don't add it in the schema, it will be added by default by MongoDB itself. So we know now that we have a newly created document which is distinct from the others based on the ID unique field, and we have a version. Don't worry about it much. And to be sure that we have successfully added this, let's connect, let's refresh, and as you can see, we have a library database newly created and a books collection, and surely enough we have successfully added this new book to our database. I'm gonna add a few more books here, whatever name to send. Now if we go back to MongoDB Compass and refresh, we can see that we have newly created documents. Now we're gonna create a few more APIs, one that will get all the documents, one that will get only one document by ID, and one that will delete, and finally an API that will update a document. Back in our code, let's first create the get API. Let's say book/all instead of create. And then here, obviously, we need a new method that we're going to create. I'm going to call it get all books. Let's go ahead and create that. It's going to be an async function as well, an async method. And we also have request, response, and next. Next, we're going to see why it's used in the future videos, future episodes. And then here, very simple, we're going to call a service as well. So let's take this, get all books, go to our service and create that function. So async get all books. It doesn't take any parameters. Now, if you recall, to create a book, the steps were to create a new instance of book model, and then we use that instance .save, of course, after passing the properties for that new instance, and then we save it. To get all, what we do instead is we actually use the book model itself. So here I'm going to say return await, of course, because it's an async operation, and book model dot. Here we have a lot of methods given by Mongoose. What we need is find, and that's it. Once we say find and we don't pass any arguments here, if we don't pass any arguments, what it does is it's gonna get all of them. We can also pass open and close curly braces. Now when we do that, it will return all the documents in that collection in the book model. Let's save, go back to our controller, and let's call it. What we could say is const results, or const books if you want, equal await, since it's an async function that we're calling, book service dot get all books. Now what we can say is if results response dot send results. This should be results. Else, of course, we can also say response dot send error. If we save, go back to Postman, let's take that, create a new call, a new request, get, of course, because we are getting data now, and here we have all, because if you go back to our routes, the route is /book/all. Let's send the request. Okay, we got an error. Cannot get book all not found. Okay, so we have an error. Let's check. Okay, we forgot to save this file. Now that we have saved it, let's send, and as you can see, we got an array of objects which are the documents existing in our database, in our collection for the books. Next, what we're gonna do is we're gonna get a specific book by its ID. Back in our code, let's create a third API. It's also get. Instead of all, I'm gonna say book by ID, and then here we're gonna need to create in our controller a new method which is gonna be get book by ID. Let's call it get book by ID. Let's go to our controller and the book.js file and create that. So async book by ID. Of course, we need to pass in the 3 parameters. And here we're going to create a constant variable for ID. And if you recall previously, for post, what we did is we got the body from the request. Now the ID shouldn't be passed in the body here. It should be passed in the query params. So in the params here, if you can see query params, it's going to be the ID key, and then we're going to have the value. So let's say request.query.id. Now if we log this after sending the request, of course it's going to show undefined. And just to be sure, let's save that. Let's save the route as well, and let's go back to Postman. Let's take this, create a new request. It's a get. We called it book by ID. If we send this and go back here, if you take a look at our console, it's undefined, and that's because we don't have an ID key in here. And of course, the request is going to keep on sending because we're not responding here. We're not sending a response yet. So it will be stuck in this. So here we need to add an ID key, and the value for that ID is gonna be the value of any ID property of any document. And this is, again, this is unique. So let's say we need to get this specific and only this book. Let's take this ID, come here and add it here. Now if we send this, if we take a look again at our console, it printed out the value of that ID, which is coming from the query params here. Let's create the service now. So I'm gonna delete this, and here of course we are gonna say const result or const book equal await book service dot, and we haven't created the method yet, but it's gonna have the same name, and we're gonna need to pass this ID to that service method so that it fetches the specific document from our database. So here I'm gonna create that method in our services, async get book by ID. It's gonna receive one parameter, which is the ID. Of course you can call it whatever you want here, but let's keep it organized, ID. And then you can say return await book model dot find one this time. If we say find one, we're gonna need to pass an object here, and we're gonna match it, for example using the ID field, and then we pass it the ID. Of course here we need to mind how we write it, because in our documents the field name is underscore ID, so we need to type it the same. Instead of find one, we could have also said find one by ID, or let's see, find by ID, and we could have passed the ID directly here. This will return the actual object that we found. That will directly find by ID, we don't have to pass in the document. Let's go back to the controller, and now we can say if result response.send result, else we're gonna send an error. Let's save this and come back here, and let's say send. As you can see, we have received the specific document. Again, we're gonna handle errors in the future episodes, so please subscribe if this is being helpful so far, like and comment. Now let's create a delete API. So let's go to the routes, and here let's say dot delete, and let's just say delete. I'm gonna call the function delete book by ID. I'm gonna take this, go here. I hope you're getting used to this. Async delete equals response next. Let's open this. We're gonna receive an ID as well, just like before. It's the same. The difference here is that instead of getting one, we're gonna actually be deleting one. So await book service dot, we're gonna call it the same thing. To keep it organized, we're gonna pass in the ID constant that we're getting from the query params, from the request query params, and in the service, let's create that. So async, my bad, this is the controller still. Let's go to the service, and here let's create this method async delete by ID. It's gonna receive an ID, and here what we can do is return await. Again, we're gonna use the model name directly dot, we can say delete one and pass in a curly braces an object with the underscore ID object key name and then the value, which is ID, or we can say delete or find one and delete, or find by ID and delete, and then we would pass in the ID. The difference is when we use find by ID and delete, it will return the document that's going to be deleted, or the deleted document. However, when we use delete one, it's going to return another object, which I believe is looks something like this, success one and modified, or something like that. I'm going to return the actual deleted document, so I'm going to be using find by ID and delete. Let's save this, and in the controller we're calling it, and if result and response.send result, else we're going to send error. Let's save this, and let's save the route here. Let's create a new API, a new request, my bad, a new request, and then here it's gonna be delete, and instead of book by ID, it's gonna say delete by ID. This is the path name that we have specified here. Oh, my bad, it's book delete. So here it should be delete only. And then of course we're gonna have the ID. This is the object that we have. We're gonna be deleting it, so send. It has deleted this specific object, so here if we send this again in the get by ID, as you can see we got an error because this book does not exist. Of course we're gonna be handling the errors in the future videos. And here if I try to delete it again, we're gonna get error because it doesn't exist anymore. Of course we're gonna also handle it with an error message saying it does not exist, 404, and so on. No worries. Let's create our final API, which is gonna be the update. So here, router.put. If you recall previously in the previous videos, we said that we use the put method name to update. And then here I'm gonna say update. And here let's call it update book by ID, or just update book. Let's create that in our controller. Let's create a method for that. So here async update book request response next. You can pause the video and try to do it by yourself. Of course we're gonna get the ID here, which is gonna be the request.query.id, because we're updating one specific book, and to be able to update a specific book we need to figure out which book it is. So we need to use the ID, which is unique for each book, so we know which book we're actually trying to update. And then we have the new version of the book. I'm gonna call it book equal request.body. And here of course we're gonna pass in the data from the body of the request. So in this API, the put API, we're gonna have both query params and a body. And then of course let's say const result equal await book service dot. We're gonna update the book, and in this one we're gonna pass in the ID and the book. And then I'm just gonna take this block and paste it here. Let's save this and go to our service, and let's see how we can update in MongoDB using Mongoose. So async update book, we're gonna get the ID, and I'm gonna say new version or new book or updated book or whatever. And here what we can do is we can say return await, and we can say book model dot find by ID and update. So this takes 2 arguments now. We need to use 2 arguments only, but it can take more. We're gonna pass in the ID, and we're gonna pass in the updated version, which is updated book. And let's say that. Let's save. And now if we go to Postman. Let's take this for example, paste it here. It's a put method, and the name here is update. Let's take this body for example, because of course we're gonna be sending a body just like we said, raw JSON format. I'm gonna call it updated document for example. Gonna set the name to updated document. And now let's get all the books again. Let's say we're gonna change this book, we're gonna update this book with this ID. So let's put the ID here, or we can change it here in this value, and this is gonna be the new version. If we press on send, now here it returned the old version, but to be sure that it's working now, let's go back to Mongoose, refresh, and as you can see here, the first document, or the document with this object ID, has a name of updated document. Now you might be asking yourself why we got the older version. Well, simply we can go back here and we can add a third argument. All we have to do is add new true, and this should be an object. Now if we save that, let's save it, go back to Postman, let's say updated again. Now if we send, we got the new version directly, we didn't get the previous version. If we go back to our collection and refresh, as you can see, we actually updated it. I'm gonna show you one more thing in this video. So basically, if you remember at the beginning, I said we're gonna use a package to validate the incoming data from the body to be sure that we have the correct properties and that we have the correct data type of each property. And if it's not correctly sent from the body, we're gonna receive an error status code 400 and a message stating that it's an error. And for that, we're going to be using a package. I'm going to open a new terminal called JOI. So npm install JOI, JOI. Let's install this. Okay, and I'm going to create another folder just to keep it clean and organized. And I'm going to call it validations. I'm going to create a file called book.js. And here, let's say const JOI equal require JOI. Here I'm gonna be exporting the validation object, so I'm gonna say module.exports equal, let's create an object, and now inside this object we're gonna have our validators or different validations. So let's just here we're gonna use the same one for creating and updating, so I'm gonna say create or update book. Okay, it's gonna be an object itself, and we're gonna validate the body. So let's say body GOI.object, and now let's open the parentheses, open the curly braces, and here we're gonna validate the incoming data, which are those name, author, number of pages, and so on. The name is gonna be GOI.string because it's of type string, and then it should be required. So if you don't have it, it's gonna show an error. Let's say the same for author. It's gonna be the same thing. We're also gonna have the same thing for summary, and then for number of pages, and also mind, we need to type it the same way. It is case sensitive, so number of pages, GOI.number, and it is also required. Now we have created an object, and this object contains the validations that we have, and inside of this object we have one validator, which is going to be the create or update book. We can also just call it validator to make it easier. And if this is a bit confusing for you, we could have, instead of exporting it directly, we could have said constant book validations equal. So this is an object that has many different objects, many different validations. The first one is to validate creating or updating the book. This is the body. The body is a GOI object which consists of 4 different parameters. 3 of them are strings, which is name, author, summary, and all of those are required. And the number of pages is number. So if we have anything different than this schema, we're gonna get an error. And let's see that in action. I'm gonna save this, and to be able to use it outside we need to say module.exports, and then now we're gonna pass in the name, so book validations, and in our routes we're gonna need to import that, so constant, I'm gonna just call it book validator, let's say, equal, and let's require it, dot slash validation slash book. Now what we need to do is, in the post route here, before the controller, we need to add one more argument here, which is a function that takes a parameter, a validation. So here we are going to use this book validator dot, we are going to use this object, create or update book validator that we have created. And to be able to use this validate function, we need to import it, and this is imported from express validation. It's a package, so let's go ahead and install that package. npm install express dash validation, And now from this package, let's say const, and here we can take only the validate functionality from it. So we can use this notation equal require and the package name, which is express validation. Let's save that, and now if we take a look here, we can use this validate function. I'm gonna close this, back to our routes. Here now we are validating the body of the request because we have specified here the body, which is a JOI.object, and we set the properties and if it's required or not. So now if we try to call this post route again, this post API, if we do not respect the validation structure, it's going to give us an error. And to test that, let's go to post and let's try to remove this, for example. If we try to send, as you can see here, we got status bad request and we got a validation error, so the validation failed. Or if we try to set a number instead of a string for summary, for example, send, again the validation has failed. Now if we bring it back how it was, send, it has worked successfully. We were able to post this newly created object. And it's the same for update. So back in our routes, we also need to add this validation here before calling the controller. And now as well, we need to respect the schema before being able to call the controller function. If you found this video helpful, please leave a like, subscribe with notifications on. If you have any questions, please ask me in the comment section down below, and see you next time. Thank you for watching.